Okay, thank you, Katie. You're going to be listening too, right? You're not going to sleep, so I hope. So we can go ahead and thank all of you for joining me tonight. This is one of my favorite subjects, in addition to all aspects of clock and watch stuff that I do all day, every day. So, but this is a great part of it. This is as I explain to people often, I love horology because it's a combination of art and science. Every clock has certainly many aesthetic components in addition to the mechanical ones, and I've always loved both parts of that. But some years ago when I came upon started to see artworks with clocks in them, it kind of rang a whole nother bell of how I could combine my love of art and going to art museums and looking at art with my passion of horology. So it came along at a great time, and as you can tell, it's blossomed into something that's taken over more and more of my life and something that I really love. So I'm very happy to be talking to all of you tonight about this. Partly in preparation for this, I looked over my entire image collection now of horology and art, and now almost afraid to say how big it's gotten. I looked at 1,246 images that I now have in my computer of clocks and art. So even though it sounds like a lot, they're not that common, and you and certainly I can go to a museum, an art museum, and never even see one. So it's something that is fun to search out and something that I love doing. But paintings and vintage photographs, any kinds of artworks with clocks and watches in them are not as common as it may seem from the fact that I have more than 1,200 now that I've accumulated over all these years. But tonight I have, I think, 99 images. You're not going to see 1,246, so sorry to disappoint you. We'd need a lot more time, obviously. So tonight I've got 99 of them that we're going to run through, and I'll talk about each as we go along. And if we start running out of time, I'll talk faster. If I'm talking too fast to begin with, I'll slow down so that we've got plenty of time to look at what we want to do and fill this nice hour up. I start with this first image because I assume that all, or at least most of you, see these articles of mine in every bi-monthly issue of the Bulletin. These started back in the March-April issue of 2012, so believe it or not, there's been that many now. I just picked out part 3 because I happen to love this image by Titian. That's from the 1500s. That shows a small German Augsburg clock with the Duchess of Urbino and her little dog. So it was one of the earliest ones that I came across, and I still love it. Today, I drafted part 26. So we're up that far, and I'll give you a sneak preview of that as we get along into the presentation. I know some of you know what I look like, but in case you don't, I thought I'd let you know what it looks like basically in the same room that I'm sitting in now. This is where I do my clock stuff, both work on clocks and work on clock history and culture and art stuff. So this is the way that I look in the happier moments in my shop, which are most of the time, unless I'm really battling with some 200-year-old timepiece that doesn't want to get fixed. I know a lot of us too think that clocks are art, and I guess I wouldn't disagree with that. Certainly, I did come across this ad in the old Chelsea clock brochure. So they're, as you see, they're actually claiming that clocks are works of art, and I'm not arguing with them. But of course, we're going to deal with fine art paintings and things which are not the actual clocks. But don't feel like I don't think clocks are art as well. Uh, as you may also have noticed, my business name is Bell Time Clocks, and this originated with this Winslow Homer print back in 1992. I bought this from a vintage book and print dealer that I knew here in Andover, Massachusetts, because I love Winslow Homer, and of course it's relating to how clocks and bells in the American Industrial Revolution played a large part in most workers' factory day. So even though there's no clock in this image, there's a clock tower, and it's right in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is the city adjacent to Andover where I live. So it's a local scene. Winslow Homer spent time in Lawrence, Massachusetts, because his brother was a supervisor there in one of the big textile mills that was built in that town. So Belltime's origin is here. And when I was trying to think of a name for my new clock business, Belltime popped into my head because I was sitting there staring at the print I just bought, and it's been a good name for my business, I feel. So whenever I mention this topic, everybody virtually says, "Oh, what about Salvatore Dali? Did you know that he has clocks in his paintings?" So I say, "Yes, of course I do, and of course I'm intrigued by them." But I didn't want any or all of you to be sitting there wondering, "Gee, I wonder if he knows about Dali, or if we're ever going to talk about Salvatore Dali." And not only do I know about this painting, but I know about this painting because it was always kind of a mystery about why Salvador Dali started with these drooping clocks and what they mean. Of course, we know he's a surrealist painter, but he explained that he had painted the background of this scene without the clocks, and including this weird pink thing that's laying about in the center of the picture, which he explains is a self-portrait. So whether or not you see him in that image, I'm not sure. But supposedly he'd painted the background in his studio, which is a scene in Spain near where he was living at the time, a coastal scene. And he went into dinner and he had a terrible migraine. So he could barely eat dinner, but he did eat some of the very soft cheese that was for dinner. And whether he was inspired by the soft drooping cheese or the migraine or both, he went back into his studio and suddenly realized that he wanted to have drooping clocks in the image. So that's his story of why we see them in this iconic painting as well as in several other images where he has these drooping clocks. I rarely, or not rarely, but don't that often get to see the paintings. I'm finding them online, or I find them in museums and I see them, but I often don't see the originals of the paintings for some time. And because I'd only seen a digital image of this Dali painting, and when I saw it in the flesh at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, I was kind of stunned at how small it was. So my wife was kind enough to take this picture, which not only shows me looking and thinking hard about this painting, but it demonstrating to all of us that it's a small painting. Maybe that's all he could manage when he was struggling with his migraine on that night. I pretty much have this field to myself as far as the depth that I've gone into it with it and the amount of time and attention I've spent to it. But I should mention that Alfred Chapuis, who some of you may know the name of, he was a very important horological scholar and collector maybe more than half a century ago now, but he did also seem to want to get into this subject. This is the book he did, which is in French, published in 1954. And it is a book of black and white images of the artworks that he discovered, and I didn't count them, but it's maybe a few dozen paintings that have clocks and watches in them. So there's a precedent for this, and there's an important precedent. I feel like I'm trying to step into some pretty important shoes if I'm trying to follow work that Alfred Chapuis did. But this book, it's kind of a rare book. It's hard to find, but it's interesting to see what he focused on. I think I have captured all of the images or located them in color of the images that are in this book. So there's nothing that's hiding there that I don't know about and won't be able to share with others. One of the earliest images that I saw is this Chinese reverse painting on glass. And maybe a lot of you have had the similar experience where you always remember the things at auction that you didn't get. And that's what happened to me with this. I saw it at a Skinner auction in Boston, and I asked the painting specialist, I said, if I leave this size bid, do you think I'll get it? And she said, oh yeah, sure, there's no interest in this. So I left what I thought was more than adequate bid, and sure enough, I was outbid. So I don't own this work, this horology and art example, reverse painting on glass, and at least I was lucky enough to have taken a picture of it, so I have its picture, but I certainly would have loved to have it, even though the glass, as you see, is broken there. It's just a lovely image. This is also one of the earliest ones that I came across and loved. This was at a Christie's auction. It's by an Italian artist named Annibale Carracci, who was certainly well known and famous. We think this was probably a African slave or servant in an Italian household, and of course she's holding an early, again, probably German Augsburg gilt table clock from that time. When I saw this at the Christie's catalog, I'd say this is, again, one of the ones that sparked my interest most severely, and I inquired with Christie's whether I could reproduce the image, and for some small fee, I was able to get the image for the NAWTC, and it was reproduced on the back cover of a bulletin some years ago. So that was kind of the Kickstarter for this, but it was before I began to do these regular series of articles that I hope a lot of you are enjoying. This was the first image in the Horology and Art series, again back in the beginning of 2012. This is by David, Jacques-Louis David, who is probably, well, some say one of the foremost French painters, if not the top of the list of French painters of the time. And this is at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and this, I thought, was a great image to start off my series of articles, which are now, as I mentioned, more than 24. So this, of course, shows the Emperor Napoleon. He's in his study in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. He's up very late at night because you can see the candle is almost burnt down. He's been working on the Napoleonic Code, we think. There are other iconic things around. And, of course, there's a beautiful regulator in the background, perhaps by Janvier. We've not exactly identified the clock. I'm not sure it exists somewhere that we can. But we also doubt that David actually painted this from life. He knew, of course, knew what Napoleon looked like, and he painted this. The other interesting thing about this is it was done as a commission for a Scottish nobleman. That's Scotland, as in the United Kingdom, but Scotland was not always sure which side they were on in the Napoleonic Wars, because they were still perhaps uneasy about their association with England. So again, this was a Scottish nobleman who wanted this picture of Napoleon when he certainly was in his prime and in his glory. We're going to go way back in time because some of this is chronological, even though I divided somewhat by themes. But this is Leonardo da Vinci, and as we know, he thought about timekeeping and clocks, and this is from one of his drawings. You also notice that it's his mirror writing, where he wrote things in a kind of a code backwards, just maybe to keep people from being able to read it, but also it was the way that he took notes. This is circa 1495, so we're not even yet into the 16th century when he's doing illustrations. Certainly we know him as an artist, so even though this is more of a technical illustration and a drawing, I would certainly count it as a work of art as well. So we're going to also be looking at very early now artistic depictions of clocks and clockmakers. This is circa 1600. It's a clock workshop, and you'll see a lot of things going on in there that I imagine was perhaps a somewhat realistic depiction of a clockmaker shop 1600, so we're back certainly more than 500 years ago, but they're already at work making some of the kinds of clocks that we'll see in some of the illustrations coming up. This is perhaps one of those examples of if they invent time travel somehow, this is maybe where I'd want to be sent back to and take a look in person of what's going on here. Here's 1698. We have another image of a clockmaker shop. So again, we see some of the tools that he's working on, some of the types of clocks which he's making and working on too, that give us this. So certainly these aren't just works of art as far as we're concerned. They can be documentary evidence for the kinds of clocks that we aspire to collect now. We see the clocks on the wall here, which we also see in museums and at auction, but in this case they're not antiques. They're the clocks of the day being portrayed in artwork of the day. This is, probably all of you know, this is John Harrison. This is Thomas King's 1767 portrait of John Harrison, and he's holding the Jeffries watch here. This is not H4, as I mistakenly called it, but we also see one of his earlier chronometers in the background as well, and this is a good illustration of how he needed to downsize the design here for these things to be practical on shipboards. It's certainly the one kind of in the shadows behind him would have been difficult both to mass produce and to find room for on the ship. We also see over his other shoulder depiction of a gridiron pendulum, which was one of his inventions as well, as we know, which helped to compensate for temperature changes. So here's a close-up of that. It's also showing a sketch, but he's holding this watch. And this image, and perhaps a few others in my presentation, you can actually see this painting in this country now. If by the end of March you head to Mystic Seaport in Mystic, Connecticut, that has a pared-down version of the longitude exhibit that originated at the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. And this painting is hanging there along with good reproductions of H1 through 3, this watch, many other fascinating artifacts from the story of longitude. Another painting that's in that exhibit is this stunning large oil painting of John Arnold at his family. This is from around 1783. So this is John Arnold and his son, who was also a horologist, even though he died early and tragically. And we see John Arnold holding a chronometer movement, and here's a close-up of that. So we're, of course, it's not crystal clear, but it's quite detailed and showing us an early example of a John Arnold chronometer who was trying to facilitate the more affordable and mass production of chronometers, so they actually could be used on shipboard and on many ships. So this is Thomas Tompion. Again, this is perhaps more documentary than artistic, but this was from a portrait by Godfrey Kneller, who was certainly a well-known English artist and portraitist of the time. This is again circa 1695, showing Thomas Tompion, and it's showing him holding a typical pocket watch of the time with the very ornate balance cock there and engraved plates that we can see. Perhaps focusing in this section on portraits of clockmakers and their clocks. So that's why we've jumped suddenly to Hanover, Massachusetts in the early 19th century, where this is John Bailey III, who was a clockmaker from an area south of Boston. And it's showing, I think, kind of a stylized representation of a clock under a glass dome there. I'm not sure I've ever seen a clock exactly like that, but it's a great likeness of another clockmaker. And here's again, sort of an illustration, but still artistic, of Black Forest clockmakers. This is circa 1900, but it's showing probably fairly accurately what a workshop in the Black Forest might have looked like, obviously in the summer where there's some light coming in and not a lot of snow outside. But it's showing a couple of fellows at work and a typical wooden plate Black Forest movement hanging on the wall to the right. So we can again see not only some art, but some indication of what it perhaps was like as the guys were making these clocks in Germany. So, of course, there's a whole other aspect of horology and art, and I think Katie might have alluded to it by first calling this art and horology when she was introducing me. We certainly know that there's plenty of aesthetic components in clocks, particularly and obviously the painting of clock dials. So that's not what I'm talking about now, and it's not what we're going to focus on ever in my horology and art project, but just to say that I'm not ignoring the fact that artists were at work in horology as well, and I particularly like this painting on the arch of a clock dial. I think it's probably better than most, perhaps not as standardized as a lot of the paintings that we see on English white dials. So if we want to start back at the beginning of mechanical horology, or even before, we're back now in the year approximately 1285, where this is a even pre-Renaissance depiction of a water clock. So we see it running there, and we actually see that there are bells which probably rang at certain times to announce the passage of the hours as the water was going through this complicated water wheel device and into the bowl below. So it's not a mechanical clock, but as you'll see, I don't stick only to mechanical clocks. I want to deal with other aspects of timekeeping too as they appear in art. Here we see 1459. This is the Virgin Mary with a clock. It's within the subject of the Horloge de Sapiens, so the wisdom clock. Whereas mechanical clocks became better known, there really was this feeling that they, more than divinely inspired, that they perhaps mirrored the creation of the universe, that God the clockmaker kind of set the world in motion the same way that a clockmaker sets his mechanical clock in motion. So there were certainly many metaphorical aspects of early clocks, and this is making it quite overt. Well, I'm not sure exactly what the Virgin Mary is doing with this clock, but it's possible that we're following that theme where she's kind of setting it in motion and addressing that issue of how the world for a time was kind of viewed as a clock, and that God was the clockmaker who created it and started it. We in 1495, an artist named Carpaccio is depicting in Italy Saint Ursula. And some of these we're going to perhaps play spot the clock because they aren't prominent in the artwork. And I sometimes draw the line if they're very small and perhaps not even enough of importance to show this. But when they are there and viewable and perhaps have historic significance, I want to include them. So in this case, here's my cursor now indicating, if you hadn't spotted already, the clock in the tower in this very early scene in Italy. And Dürer, the German artist, this is 1513. There certainly are other of his very famous etchings and engravings. This one in particular, this is titled Night, Death, and the Devil. And like many of these, as I point out in my articles, the timekeepers truly are there for more than decorative reasons. They're part of the whole narrative in the painting. They're a metaphor for time's passage and all. In this case, it's a sand glass that we're talking about. And at first, people thought, I wonder if this is a very early depiction of a mechanical clock too, because we have a dial at the top of the sand glass. But we do know now, and I think Fortunato Müller-Mürki, my friend, pointed out in the bulletin perhaps a few years ago that this was not a timekeeper, but it was a counter which kept track of the number of times that you turned over the sand glass. So it actually, unlike most sand glasses that just tell you when 3 minutes is up or 30 minutes is up or 2 hours is up. This actually, you could accumulate the timekeeping and use it for longer periods of time and use it partly as a way to tell the time. So this is another image by Titian, who did that Duchess of Urbino that we looked at in our first image. This is from 1558. And Titian certainly liked to have clocks in his images. I have several examples. And you can see, because there are so few actually objects in this painting, that it's not there by accident. This didn't just happen to be a photo or photographic type of representation of this Italian nobleman. The clock is in there to indicate, as it does in other Titian paintings and others, that this was a sophisticated, modern, technologically interested Renaissance man of his time, that he wanted the clock in the image. Of course, he could have told Titian not to put it in there. He wanted it in there. He wanted it as part of the image to display that he was modern. It also was a metaphor for discipline and attention to detail. So it's in there as an important way to look at these. And sometimes when I'm doing the longer presentations, I actually then show museum or collector examples of these actual clocks, because they do exist in museums and you can study them more closely, because one's certainly like that. This is, some claim, perhaps the earliest depiction of a watch, and that's why I left the caption underneath it. So this is, we believe, showing Cosimo I de' Medici in Florence, and he's holding a watch, and again the claim is perhaps this is the earliest depiction of a watch. You see that it's one-handed, it has an interesting cover, certainly not a glazed cover, so it's and it dates to about 1560. If someone there has a painting of a watch older than that, I'm sure that I and others would like to hear about that. Peter Claes was a Dutch artist, one of perhaps the most famous for still life paintings, and this is what's called a vanitas, in which the message was the passage of time and how your time here on Earth is fleeting and transitory, and you need to pay attention to what you're doing in this life and prepare for the next life. So, but his paintings are just fantastic. There's more than 250 known of his paintings. He was quite prolific, and many of them that are known have pocket watches in them. And not only is it in there to show the passage of time, but it also was a way for him to display his extreme level of skill at painting detail, and particularly painting technically complicated shiny metal things in a way that you really could see what they were. This particular watch, I'm just noticing this now, seeing it big on my screen, this is probably what's called a montre tact, where there's no cover over the top. You would open it and you could actually feel the hand and the hour position, so without being able to see the watch, you could tell what time it was. Not only was this convenient for blind people, but it also worked in a time when you, just like now, you don't want to be obviously checking your time in your meeting. This would be a way for you to check the time without people knowing that you were doing it. So now I'm actually glad that I picked this as one of them, because I hadn't noticed that particular detail before. Peter, this is another example of Claes's paintings, and not only do we get another great detailed image of a pocket watch, again, which were important, valuable things for people to own. It was understood that these were expensive and exotic and interesting, so having them in a painting wasn't a fluke. It was something that was important to have in there to show that they were technically advanced. But this is a bonus too, because in the sphere that he painted, we see the artist himself. This is something that some artists do. Other times there's a Vermeer where we also see this happening, but there's the artist and his easel and the watch reflected in the sphere. So this is kind of a twofer, where we're getting a watch and we're getting the artist's image at the same time. You may remember this image, which was in the most recent bulletin feature, Horology and Art. This is a Rembrandt, and as I mentioned in the article, if you remember that, it's certainly an anachronistic view, because it's Christ and Pilate, long before the days of mechanical timekeeping of any kind, and but yet we see a clock in a tower to the right there. And as I mentioned in the article too, this image is a grisaille, a drawing from which the etching, engraving was eventually done, and when the engraving was published, the clock was gone. So probably Rembrandt, for whatever reason, or else he was reminded that they didn't have clocks like this back then, and it doesn't appear in the engraving. But we think he might have been inspired by a similar looking clock that's in Venice. So if we look back, there's the arch and the clock above it in the drawing, and there's an image by Guardi, who was one of the well-known painters of Venetian scenes, and we're seeing a similar looking clock with an arch below it. And it maybe verifies that those kinds of things existed. At first you think, well, they must have had some complicated pulley system in order for the weight to descend not directly under the clock, and clearly that must be what they did, because we don't see the weight hanging down inside the arch. Dutch still life painters were somewhat numerous, not just Peter Claes that I mentioned before. Here's one from 1663, Willem van East, if I'm pronouncing that right. So very luxurious images, and if you didn't understand why the watch was there, you might think it's kind of odd to have this luxurious painting, and suddenly there's a mechanical object, a pocket watch, sitting there below it. Here's a close-up of the watch in that image. Again, you can see this is extremely detailed. You can see not only the fusee, but the fusee chain is visible in this, and down in the bottom right, the great little interesting cranked watch key, which if we're lucky enough to find along with these watches when we collect them, we're very happy to see that. I mentioned that this isn't just mechanical timekeeping, and several of my images that I have in my collection are hourglasses, sand glasses. We saw one previously in the Dürer print, but here's another one. This is also it's 1671, also a Vanitas theme, of course. Skulls figure in many of these Vanitas scenes, again, as symbols of mortality and using your time wisely now. Many Dutch paintings have clocks in them, and I'm very glad that Ronnie Baer, who's the curator of Dutch painting at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, is going to be one of my speakers in that October 2017 Horology and Art Symposium that I've organized here in Boston. But we see wonderful examples of Dutch clocks on the walls of these scenes, and even on the tiles. This is a Delft tile dating back to the 17th century, which shows a Dutch clock on that typically blue background. Here I have another 1745, again, hourglass in the image. Again, not in there by accident. The painter didn't have to put it in there, but it's symbolizing the passage of time, and that's perhaps even an angel or Father Time there, because actually the title of this is Time Revealing Truth. So the gentleman holding the hourglass is a allegorical depiction of time. William Hogarth, certainly a well-known English painter, has several fun examples of clocks and images. He did a lot of prints and engravings, some of them instructive, some of them humorous. This is the Graham family, painted in 1742, and we see a lovely English ebonized bracket clock off there to the left that's part of the scene, this family children's scene. Piranesi, who we know is quite a graphic artist of the time. This is a 1760 where he was depicting several designs of clocks. Perhaps these clocks were actually made, some of them, these clock cases, perhaps not, but these were some of his concept drawings for very luxurious clock designs. So I also, of course, love to have cartoons and caricatures. This is an artist in 1786 did this print, Elisha North, Full and Half Pay Officers, kind of a humorous scene in an area where between wars a lot of military officers, some were kept in active service at full pay, others were sort of semi-pensioned off at half pay, so that's what the title refers to. And Thomas Rowlandson is one of my favorite caricaturist artists of that English period. This is 1799. The title is Late Hours. You can probably figure out what's going on here even without the title of Matrimonial Comforts that you see up top there, and you see a fun depiction of a tall clock in the background, and of course it belongs there since the subject is perhaps when the gent is getting home a little after the time he indicated he was going to. Goya, certainly one of the eminent Spanish painters of the time, has some artists in there. There will be a curator talking about Goya in my symposium as well. This is a 1783 depiction of the Count of Florida Blanca, I guess white Florida, showing a great bracket clock to the side. Another Goya painting of a lady circa 1800 with a watch hanging on a chain, and these are always of interest to people who study fashion of the time too, because you can look at what she's wearing, and we can also look at how the watch was being worn by ladies of the time. This is the Crystal Palace, the 1851 World's Fair, sort of the kickoff of all modern world fairs in London. This is the United States area of it, and you see off to the right, we see a display of clocks there. I'm increasingly interested in the Crystal Palace exhibition and the American presence there, and I hope to do other articles and talks about that because there's some important visuals from that time that are fun and instructive to look at as well. But again, this would be another place I'd certainly want to go when time travel is invented, is to spend a day or a week at the Crystal Palace looking at the tens of thousands of things that they thought were worthy of exhibit there. So moving on now, here's we're in Europe and we're looking at a Edgar Degas family portrait. This is actually his aunt and her family in Italy. He went and lived with them for a while. We see a nice French clock probably off to the right there. This was not a happy family. And this painting stayed with Degas his entire life. It was in his studio when he died. He showed it once. It wasn't well received, and perhaps either he didn't think a buyer would be interested in it, or they found the subject matter too disturbing to want to look at again. Here's Manet. This is his wife, 1867, the artist Manet playing the piano. We're seeing certainly more of the trending towards Impressionist art, where we certainly can't read a name on the clock dial. We can't quite even determine exactly what the clock looked like, but we certainly know that it's a clock and that it's there in this Manet image. And Paul Cézanne too. He's certainly someone who didn't paint literally and totally with illustration in mind, and he's certainly saying something here too. We have examples of other paintings with no hands on the clock. The painter is making a statement there that it's the clock itself, perhaps not the time that it indicates, that's what we're most interested in. So this is Cézanne. We certainly can recognize this as a black French marble black clock, but not much more than that about it. And Henri Matisse, this famous painting that's also in New York City of the Red Studio, and we can imagine that this was in a sense an accurate portrayal of his studio, and that he had this type of clock, which could be a Morbier style clock that was in his studio. We can get a pretty good sense of what it was from what we can see there, particularly the dial that looks like those fired pieced dial of fired enamel. So I love this painting too. It's also in New York. This is an artist called Otto Dix, a German painter. This is from 1922. It's the businessman Max Rosberg in Dresden. Dix was known for aging and kind of caricaturing his portrait subjects. So he didn't do too bad a job with this businessman, but from what we know, the businessman was probably 20 years younger than he's depicted in this painting. So Van Gogh, too, of course, we would love to find things by him, and we find a few. This is the Potato Eaters. If you're having trouble spotting the clock, again, it's up in the top left, little wall clock in this Dutch interior scene. This is a sketch by Van Gogh, so again, his clock images are not numerous, so I was happy to locate this sketch as well, showing kind of a simple wag on the wall clock that he sketched and perhaps never used in a full-size painting. This was one of my Horology and Art feature articles. This is the Night Cafe. It's in the Yale Museum in New Haven, 1888, and you can read, of course, much more about it in my feature article showing this scene where he's pretty much captured the feeling of late night inebriation in a provincial Parisian cafe. Giorgio de Chirico was also someone I featured in a Horology and Art feature. This is 1914. He had these kind of surrealist landscapes, often had a train in the background. We think because his father was a railroad engineer in Greece and built train lines for the Greek government and train industry, but the clocks feature often in these landscapes, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, but they're there, and again, not by accident. This Marc Chagall has several depictions of usually this Vienna regulator style of clock. We know from his early history in Eastern Europe when he was in Jewish shtetls or enclaves that this was a clock that was in his family at the time. And we see it in several images when he's hearkening back to those days in the Jewish Eastern European communities. And we see that this is an RA clock of that period. So, and there's an artist named Charles Spenceley, an English artist. This is 1935, where he's laying the clock. There must be a few dozen paintings. Spenceley apparently loved clocks, owned several as a collector, and loved to include them in his paintings. In this case, he's oiling one of these German wooden plate shield clocks, but I guess we love to see images where someone's actually working on the clock and the clock is in there in a prominent position like this. This is Rene Magritte, The Interpretation of Dreams. We see a clock in this. What he's trying to say here is that words and images are kind of arbitrary. We've decided that a particular word means a certain thing in our language. So in the bottom right, the valise actually corresponds with the valise. But in the other cases, the words don't correspond with the picture. But that's really only because we've decided to call these things what we call them. So it's an interesting thought game to go down the road that he started us on with these images. But this is certainly a much more famous and fun Rene Magritte image. This you can view in Chicago. It's called Time Transfixed. It's in 1938 with again a typical French black marble clock, but probably not many of us see it in a place where a locomotive is steaming out of the fireplace below it. I love Japanese prints, and again at the symposium in 2017 we'll hear from the Japanese prints curator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, because there are many with clocks in them and they always show this distinctive style of Japanese clock. As we know, the Japanese had a different system of timekeeping based on uneven length hours, so it's interesting to see Japanese clocks in these images. Here's another one too, where again we can see that it's a folio style. You can see it ticking because Japanese clocks were primitive after Japan closed its borders and was closed for a few hundred years. They continued to make clocks in the old style. You may have seen my article in the most recent bulletin about the only remaining clock repair school in Japan that I visited last year, and the adjacent clock museum at the Tenji Shrine, in which there are several examples of these kinds of clocks. Let's go to America again, and we'll go through a little chronological view of America. Most people think this is Paul Revere's view of the Boston Massacre, but actually the clockmaker that many of us know, Joseph Mulliken, climbed on the bandwagon too shortly after the Boston Massacre. He too issued a print, probably based on or copied from the Paul Revere engraving, showing this. So this is not Revere, it's a clockmaker, Mulliken, who also did engraving. And there was also the issue too of what time the clock said, because the first Revere engraving had the clock at the wrong time of the Boston Massacre. And he quickly produced a second edition in which the clock says the correct time of the event. There's some wonderful folk art paintings from American 19th century. This is a Joseph Davis. He did several of these kind of primitive folk art images. He was an itinerant painter, and often they show a banjo clock. And this is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, this painting. So if you attend the symposium next year, you'll be able to view this painting. It's a rustic frolic with a tall clock in the background. Another the folk art painting, this one showing an oversized pocket watch and a wonderful family view. This is by Robert Peckham. He did the painting that I show in part 2 of my Horology and Art articles from a few years ago. There's a little girl holding a clock, another great folk art painting. Perspective's a little weird, but we're showing great floor cloths, great fashion indicators, as well as depicted timepiece. This is one of my favorites too. Look at this this great girl. This is also at the Museum of Fine Art. The perspective's a little odd, as we see. She's quite big. The steeple clock in the background's quite small. And there's this is a boy. As you know, boys often wore dresses when they were very young like this. And there's a pocket watch on the chair. Fractures, these German illustrations from Pennsylvania Dutch area, often showed clocks, again, as indication of the transitory nature of time. Lisa Minardi, who's a Winterthur curator, she'll be speaking at this year's event and also is signed up for the 2017 symposium to talk about fractors. There's another fractor with a great depiction of a clock, very colorful images. This is a let's see, yes, Francis Edmonds, 1844. This is a peddler who's visiting a home. He's got his tray of wares up top, trying to entice the family, and we see an interesting wall clock off on the left. This is from the New York Historical Society. This is Peter Stuyvesant and the Cobbler. It's a famous anecdote from early New England, early New York history when the Dutch ruled New York. And he's the story is that this cobbler was standing there ranting against the government that Stuyvesant headed. Stuyvesant came along and handed him this pocket watch and said, "Here, sir, fix my pocket watch." And the cobbler said, "You know, I don't know anything about fixing watches." And Stuyvesant said, "Well, you know, if you don't know anything about fixing pocket watches, you don't know anything about running a government either, so you shouldn't be up here talking." So that's a great allegorical scene, and we see a watch there too. Again, a symbol, this is Worthington Whitridge, 1864, showing a clock and following the theme of the title of the painting, which is retrospection. Edward Lamson Henry is one of my favorites, and in fact today I just completed Clock and Art Part 26 and sent it off to our bulletin editor, and it's another painting by Edward Lamson Henry, which is this famous painting, The Old Clock on the Stairs, based on the Longfellow poem. Which was inspired during Longfellow's honeymoon, which he spent in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, at this home of a relative. This is the old clock on the stairs with the familiar refrain at the end of each stanza: "Forever, never, never, forever." So this is also a preview. This is going to be the next image in my Clock and Art publication that's coming out in the next bulletin. This is Winslow Homer. I looked long and hard, and this is a relatively unknown painting that's in the art gallery of Texas A&M University down in College Station, Texas. It's showing a young woman winding a clock with a cello there, and you'll read more about that in my article, but I was certainly thrilled to find such a beautiful Winslow Homer watercolor painting. This is kind of a interesting, somber scene. This is by an artist called George Wright in 1883. It's called The Quarters. It's a great picture of one of those French ebonized portico clocks under its glass dome, so it's a documentary in that sense. But I just love the scene of these two guys, probably rivals for the young woman's attention, and it doesn't look like any of the three are having a particularly good time. Perhaps the little pug dog in the center is enjoying the scene the most. This is a trompe-l'oeil painting. This is John Haberly, 1900, who was one of the best-known trompe-l'oeil American painters. So this looks like he painted an OG clock on the wall, but this is actually the entire painting. And there was a later art critic and collector who was searching for trompe-l'oeil paintings by Haberly and went to the house where this clock painting was hanging, and he walked by it because he thought it was the clock hanging on the wall. He didn't realize it was the painting of the clock hanging on the wall. But now we know that it is, and it's a great example of trompe-l'oeil painting. These are fun too. This was Cassius Coolidge, 1903. A series of these were painted as advertisements for Brown and Bigelow cigars. You see there's a lot of smoking going on here too. The title of this is A Friend in Need. We see one friend passing a particularly good card to his neighbor there, and we see the tall clock in the background with indicating that no doubt it's a very late hour as this poker game is going on. This is a Diego Rivera, So certainly a higher level of artistic competence than Cassius Coolidge, but this is his 1914 image called the alarm clock. Horace Pippin was an increasingly well-known African-American artist, and several of his views of African-American interiors show clocks, more typically alarm clocks, but this is showing perhaps a little better clock in this household, and we'll see some of his and others. This is one I just came across. This is Everett Shinn, who was in the Ashcan School of American Artists. It's a great painting entitled "He's the Man for Me," painted in 1945. Edward Hopper has several. I featured one of his in an article. We'll see it in one of my articles. You'll see it shortly. This one, get in New York City in the Met, I believe, is called Tables for Ladies. We see most of the big gallery clock up top there, 1930 painting. This is the one that's in my article from a couple of years ago called 7 a.m., and you can read more about it in that article, but it's typical of his kind of eerie scenes, but certainly the clock is front and center in this painting. Norman Rockwell, perhaps there have been arguments that he's an illustrator, not an artist, but those arguments are over. He's certainly an artist, and this is entitled Young Henry Ford. As we know, Henry Ford got his start in the as a watch and clock hobbyist in his teens. He was fixing clocks using bent nails, supposedly, as screwdrivers and tweezers, but this is a Rockwell depiction of young Henry Ford. I'm hoping to have our 2018 symposium at the Henry Ford Museum, where we'll look much more into Henry Ford as a horologist and horology collector. This is Andy Warhol. This is all I could find of him, and not that I was looking that hard, but this is an early sketch of his in 1953, where he's not only talking about clocks, but kind of the passage of time. This might take some study if anybody's that interested, but there is an Andy Warhol. This has been in my articles as well. This is Jamie Wyeth, Screen Door to the Sea, painted in 1994. I met Jamie Wyeth on a couple of occasions and asked him if he still owns this clock, and he says, oh yes, definitely. It's not on Monhegan Island anymore, which is where this was painted, but nearby on another island where he has his family home. The clock still stands in his house there. Probably a Maine clock, but I didn't get a chance to ask him the specifics if he knew them, and he hasn't invited me yet to his house there. So hopefully someday I'll be able to look at the clock and then tell you all more about it. There's a whole area of photography, some of it fine art photography, and I did feature something by Berenice Abbott in one of my installments. And there's always a question of whether they're actually art or simply photographic documentations of something, but I couldn't resist. This is certainly very early. It's a daguerreotype, and it's a stereo daguerreotype, so with a special viewer you would actually get the stereoscopic effect of this. This is an Italian painting, an Italian photograph, and I and probably others out there have owned these calendar clocks. They're French, but this perhaps was done in the Italian language. So I had to put in at least one example of photography to show that it's included, as are illustrations. This is an Alice in Wonderland illustration where he's holding the pocket watch. So included in my 1,200 plus images are things that perhaps not everyone would call fine art. They could be illustration art, but they're still part of the story and often quite competent artistically, as well as a lot of postcards and calling cards and trade cards that are artistic representations as well. It's not Van Gogh or Manet, but they're fun to find and collect, and they often depict timepieces that we collect and are interested in knowing more about. Edward Gorey, if some of you watch Masterpiece and see his introductions, Edward Gorey did the graphic artist for that, and he's done several with clocks in them. This is his wonderful image of a clock shop being viewed in winter. This, of course, is an iconic Norman Rockwell as well, showing a guy setting a large street clock in Chicago. The New Yorker covers occasionally also have one. This is from not long ago, 2012, showing Santa telling, it's on the same theme as our Cassius Coolidge poker playing dogs, except these are poker playing reindeer, and obviously it's about time for them to not hit the road maybe, but hit the roofs, hit the sky to get busy on Christmas Eve. I have this image to remind you, too, that the Boston Museum of Fine Arts is our location in 2017 for the symposium. This is the dramatic entrance of the building that I hope all of you will see. Here's a reminder here, too, showing the dates, and I hope you'll keep that in mind. Of course, there'll be more about this as we go on. And it's also showing one of the few horology and art items that I actually own. This is a John Worf painting that I bought at an auction not too long ago. He was a New England regional painter, lived in Provincetown most of his life, and this was an abandoned farmhouse, is the title, where he painted things including an image of a clock on the mantle as well, some other great antique artifacts. And just to put in a plug for this year's symposium that I've also organized at the Winterthur Museum, this is the front entrance at Winterthur. I hope that all of you will see this in person as you assemble there to have our event this year. This is the teaser for that as well. You see it's on Columbus Day weekend this year. We're going to spend 2.5 days with probably the most knowledgeable American horology experts. Many speakers will tell us, using the 100+ clock collection at Winterthur as the basis of the discussion. What we see here is a beautiful, wonderful Peter Stretch clock that's recently acquired by Winterthur, is in the collection and will be spoken about as well. So I'm wrapped up here. I hope there'll be some questions I can answer, and I'll leave this on the screen so you can again remember what I look like. If you haven't already met me, you see my contact information there and my encouragement for you to contact me. If you find clock and art images, don't worry that I've already seen it, because if I have, that's great to see it again. If I haven't, I'd be very happy to add it to my collection, and just to talk about anything, including the upcoming symposiums, and encourage you or help you to register for those. So thanks very much for listening. If Katie's gotten some questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If not, you can all get ready to watch Downton Abbey in an hour. Thanks so much.
Okay, Bob, we do have a couple of questions, and just as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your control panel. So, Bob, our first question is from Dale, and he would like to know about the Chinese reverse painting that you showed at the beginning. Do you know
Yes.
when it was made and by whom?
Sorry, Dale, I don't. I guess if I had bought it, I might have had some indication on it, but I doubt that too. But this style of Chinese painting, most likely it's China trade, if I had to say, because a lot of these were made to sell to the Westerners who were admitted into Canton and those areas before the whole country was opened up. But that would just be a theory on my part. And most often, too, I've looked into China trade paintings, because that's a whole another subject, and there are clocks in other ones. So I have spent a little time kind of trying to learn about those things, and my guess is that we would never know the artist, because they almost never sign their paintings, and we would just have to guess at when it's from.
Okay. Our next question is from George, and Bob, this may be a very difficult question for you, because he asks, which of the paintings, including clocks or watches, is your favorite and why?
I often get that question about clocks, because people come into my shop in my house where I have a lot of clocks, and I say, well, which one is your favorite? And I mean, I'm glad people ask the question, but I always say that I have the luxury, maybe, or I give myself the luxury of not having a favorite, because by picking one, I then have to exclude others. There are certainly ones that I really am thrilled that I've found, and I think I've shown several of those tonight because the ones I'm less interested in, I don't show, and certainly I have special strong feelings for the earliest ones that I've found that I've shown you, like the Karachi one of the African woman holding the clock, and the one of Napoleon standing with the regulator behind him. So I suppose if I owned all those paintings and suddenly the house caught on fire, which one would I run out with? Maybe it would be one of the ones I just mentioned, but so far I don't have to make that kind of decision, and I'm just going to love them all.
Okay. And Dale has another question for you, Bob. I am always seeing clocks in movies and TV shows, but never make an effort to remember which shows have them. He thinks the Cosby Show had a tall case clock prominently displayed. Would you consider this horology and art?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for a second one, Dale. Yes, I would say that in my digital collection I have maybe 30 or 40 stills from films. And whenever my wife and I are watching movies or TV shows and we see a clock or a watch, we elbow each other. And if it's prominent enough, sometimes I'll hit the pause button and take a screenshot because uh, I think it certainly in many cases a filmmaker would call his product art. So I don't think it's wrong to say that an image from a movie, particularly if it's by an important filmmaker, a still from that would be art as well. Certainly one of my favorites is Around the World in 80 Days, where there's several shots of David Niven standing in his well-appointed house in London in rooms full of clocks. So I certainly have screenshots from that. Of course, the movie High Noon, we're always looking at the clock. But it also brings me to the other notion is that perhaps not many of you have had the opportunity to see Christian Marclay's 24-hour film called The Clock. What he does is he takes anywhere from 5 to 20-second film segments that have a clock or a watch in them and weaves them all into a real-time presentation covering 24 hours. So for example, if he has, say, a scene from High Noon where that store regulator clock shows 12:05, you will be sitting in the museum watching the film at 12:05 when that image of the clock showing 12:05 comes on. The same as images of films where Humphrey Bogart looks at his watch and it's 11:53 on his watch. It will be 11:53 in the room that you're watching the film in. This is an artwork that is not available on DVD, sadly. It's owned by museums, and it can be occasionally museums will devote the manpower to screening it in a 24-hour cycle because that's the only way that the artist will permit it to be viewed. So when it was at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, it had to be viewed in real time and overnight, and guards had to be available. Sadly, I only saw 4 or 5 hours of it, but it's a fascinating, wonderful thing, and I'm begging the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to again screen it during our 2017 symposium so that we all can revel in that for as much of the 24 hours as we can possibly give it.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have, Bob. So thank you again, and thank everyone for attending this webinar. Just want to remind everyone that as you exit the webinar, you will receive a survey on our presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback to us. It's how we get ideas for future webinars. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to the recording of this webinar if you would like to view it again. And remember that the program committee has organized these monthly webinars, and all of the earlier presentations are recorded and available for viewing on our website. And also be sure to check our website for the listing of upcoming webinars. So thank you, Bob, and thank everyone again.
Thank you. Good night.